Hello and welcome to this video lecture. In this lecture we're going to be talking about natural selection. Natural selection is one of the many mechanisms of evolution. We'll be describing some of the other mechanisms as well in some of the other video lectures, but this is one of the mechanisms. It's one of the most important. It's the one that was proposed and described first by Charles Darwin, and later, even at around the same time, by another scientist by the last name of Wallace. Recall that we have already defined, in some sense, evolution as it being a change in characteristics in a population over time, right? And the nickname to natural selection that sometimes we attribute to Darwin, which actually didn't come from him, it came from a different person as well, is this idea of survival of the fittest. The idea that there are just some individuals that, given a particular environment, happen to have characteristics that give them the added benefit of surviving, and therefore they survive, reproduce, and have offspring that have those same characteristics that gave them, their parents, the advantage, and now they have those same characteristics as well. So we're going to learn a little bit about this. We're going to do this by playing with colored dots and paper. Now, because this is a lecture, I've done this digitally, but you could do this at home, or if you want, you can come into the lab. We've got some of these papers and dots, and you could work with them if you want. But we're going to kind of just think through this a little bit. So imagine that we've punched out little paper dots, right? These little circle dots from different colored paper. And then let's imagine that we've also taken some colored paper and we've laid these out. So right now I've got three different colors here: blue, orange, and green. And these three different colors, you can think of them as these are the different environments in which these dots are going to live. And these dots, you can think of them as a little organism that has lots of morphology, but we're going to concentrate right now primarily on the morphology of color, exterior color. So if I take a bunch of these dots and I spread them out across the papers, so I put a bunch on the blue, and I put a bunch on the orange, and I put a bunch on the green, and in fact I'm starting with exactly 6 dots of each color, and I put those on these different papers. We're going to call this our generation 1, and then we mix these things up on the paper, and what you do is you act as if you're like this bird, this predatory bird or something, and you're going to go in and you're going to have your eyes closed while the dots are being mixed up, and then you go in and you open your eyes really quick and you grab kind of the first dot that you see, right? And if you keep doing that and have someone mix up the dots, and then you go in and grab a dot, and then someone mixes up the dots, and then you go in and grab the dot, and if you did that successively, and maybe take out about half the dots, you would end up with many of these colors leaving. Now, obviously, you're going to probably, if you're doing this like a predator where you're just you only have a moment to go in and find your prey, you're probably going to be pulling out dots that maybe have a larger contrast to the background than other dots. But it doesn't mean that you couldn't pull, a green dot from the green paper like over here. So that would be what's happened at the end of the first generation. Not all individuals are going to survive because many of the individuals were plucked off by this predator. So there was a selective pressure that was placed on these individual dots inside of their individual environments. So if we discard all of those that were plucked off, now we allow the surviving generation to reproduce. And so we're just going to simply just say we're going to double the population. So for as many blue dots as there are on this blue environment, we're going to double that many dots. For as many red, so there's only 4 red dots here, so only 4 more red dots will be populated. So we can do that for each of these populations. So we've now doubled all the dots, right? And then we repeat this process where you mix up the dots, you have someone go in and grab a dot as if they're a predator, and you do that successively so that they're just having just a moment to grab a dot. They can't come in and study the pattern and figure it all out. They just have to grab whatever's there. If you do this again, you are going to, again, have changes. I won't show all the movement this time, but here we are into the generation 3, or we went into generation 2, now we're in generation 3. We repeat the process again, we go to generation 4, we repeat the process again, we double the We keep doubling the population and then going in and selecting out some and then doubling. And here we are in generation number 5. And so we're going to do it one more time, and we'll end up with a generation 6, and we'll compare that back to our generation number 1. So here's generation number 1, and here's now our last generation, generation 6. So you can see there are some striking differences, right, between these two generations. And again, you may recall that in the first generation, all of the papers had 6 dots of each color, and now we can go out and count what are the final dots. So here's a graph showing this, right? In the first generation, they all had equal amounts, but now in the last generation, the blue paper population has primarily the blue and the kind of blue-green and the purple dots, and the orange paper has primarily orange, a little bit of red, and a little bit of the green was still there. And then the green paper has primarily green, a little bit of the blue-green and the blue, right? So this is, if you think about it, this makes complete sense, right? Because given this environment, or given an environment that is, let's go to the orange one here, given an environment that is orange, if you happen to be a color that matches the background, because that's what you are, not because you strived to be that color, or because you thought you could change your color, you are what you are, and that's what the genetics of each individual organism determines. Then you really have all that you are is you show that to the environment, and if there's a predator or any type of selective pressure at all, that selective pressure, you either have an advantage or a disadvantage relative to other individuals in the population, right? In this case, an orange dot had a much higher advantage than a purple dot, right? Or than a blue dot. They stand out a lot more than the orange dot. In the blues, some blues were good and some, but it wasn't maybe the advantage wasn't quite as much as the orange dots. And then the green, there's no green that really matched exactly kind of the background, but there's the darker green, and that one did a little bit better, but the blues did okay. But the oranges and the reds did not do well on the green background at all. So that's a cartoon way of thinking about natural selection. Now the outcomes of natural selection, there are kind of 3 main outcomes. So now we're going to look at actually an organism here and think about this in terms of an organism. Here we have this mouse, and so you can imagine a population of mice where they have varying fur colors. If, for whatever reason, the background, right, of this environment, I don't know, let's say they're living in a field and there's a fire, right? And so you have this fire that happens, and so now the background is more dark. Well, you're going to push the population towards the more dark fur coat color, and that we call directional selection. And that's exactly kind of what we just saw in the paper dot example as well. Everything was kind of moving in a particular direction, so we call that directional selection. But there's also 2 other types of outcomes that can happen. One is called disruptive or diversifying selection. This is where the middle ground is selected against. And so you could imagine, maybe if these mice happen to live in an area where there's white sand and lava rocks that are like black, right? And so you have these really contrasting environments right next to each other. The population might be disrupted such that it's favoring really light-colored mice and really dark-colored mice. If this were to continue long enough and this pressure was strong enough, you potentially could split the population into 2 separate species even. The third possible outcome of natural selection is what's called stabilizing selection, where you select against the extremes. You select against the really white mice or the really brown mice, and that might be a scenario where you kind of have a background that's just more middle ground. And there's lots of examples of this, in nature that we could give for each of these. One that's kind of fun to think about is, babies' head sizes or baby's weight. It's not a good thing to be a small baby and have a small head, but it's not a good thing to be a huge baby and have a huge head. And even before C-sections, this was a very tight kind of stabilizing selection. So baby's height or baby's weight, size, and head size all was kind of centered right in the middle. An interesting thing happened once C-sections occurred, because that released a little bit of the selective pressure on the one end, such that babies' heads could get a little bit bigger because they didn't have to come down the birth canal. They could come out of through surgical surgically, right, coming right out of the stomach. And so that selective pressure was released, a little bit. And if you actually go and look at babies' head sizes, which can also be compared to babies' weight over the last 80 years, you'll see it's gradually gotten a little bit bigger because of that. So anyway, these are the 3 different outcomes of natural selection. In the rest of this topic, we'll continue to learn more about natural selection and how it's a mechanism of evolution.